before I introduce today's plenary keynote speaker, just want to give you some sort of a glance at the numbers, since most of you are engineers. We have 4 main and 9 theme keynote speakers for this conference, 155 oral platform presentations and 41 mini symposia, 18 workshops and tutorials, a total of about 2,000 papers, about half are posters, half are oral. As ZP mentioned earlier on, we are represented by 68 countries. If you want the ranking in terms of the largest numbers, of course the US is number 1, and then Japan, Australia, Canada, and Germany. We have over 30 sponsors and exhibitors. And of course, I'd like to thank our organizing committee, my program co-chairs, Gert and Jim, and Atam Dawan, who's organized the mini symposia, and many people who took part, the team chairs, the track chairs, and of course all of you. It takes a whole village to make a conference, so thank you for coming. So anyway, I'd like to now turn to introducing our keynote speaker today, Dr. William Brody. Dr. Brody is the president of the Salk Institute of Biological Sciences. He joined the Salk Institute in March of 2009 after 12 years as president of the Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Brody received his bachelor and master's degrees in electrical engineering from MIT, and his MD degree and his PhD also in EE from Stanford University. Following his postgraduate training in cardiovascular surgery and radiology at Stanford, he also went to the National Institute of Health as a postdoc and University of California, San Francisco for postgraduate work. Dr. Brody became an associate professor and then professor of radiology and electrical engineering at Stanford for 9 years. And then from 87 to 94, he became the Martin Donner Professor and Director of the Department of Radiology, and Professor of Electrical Engineering and Professor of Biomedical Engineering at Johns Hopkins. He was also Radiologist in Chief at the Johns Hopkins Hospital. He went on to become the Provost of the Academic Health Center at the University of Minnesota for a couple of years, and then people recruited him back to Johns Hopkins and became, in 1996, the president of the Johns Hopkins University until he moved to the Salk Institute. So renowned for his achievements in biomedical engineering, Dr. Brody has over 100 publications, 2 US patents in the field of medical imaging. He's made contributions in medical acoustics, computed tomography, digital radiography, and magnetic resonance imaging. And these contributions have led to his recognition in numerous national and international organizations. He's a member of the Institute of Medicine and the National Academy of Engineering, a fellow of the IEEE, the American College of Radiology, the American Heart Association, the International Society of Magnetic Resonance in Medicine, the American Institute of Biomedical Engineering, American Institute of Biomedical and Medical Engineering, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In 2010, he was awarded the Gold Medal of the Radiological Society of North America for his contributions in medical imaging science. He's been also a co-founder of 3 medical device companies, served as president and CEO of Resonex from 1984 to 1987. Dr. Brody serves as a member of the Scientific Management Review Board of the National Institute of Health and on the board of directors of IBM and Novartis. He is a member of the board of trustees of Stanford University. I could go on. It will take an hour to list all his accomplishments, but I think it's time for his talk. And I should also tell you that Dr. Brody has learned Chinese quite well, so maybe he'll want to start his talk in Chinese. So, Dr. Brody.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. 大家好. Oh, sorry, I'm not in China. Well, we've come a long way. I mean, look at this wonderful, wonderful audience. It reminds me of 1964. I was applying to medical school, and I was a student at MIT, and I wanted to combine medicine and engineering, and I applied to a very famous medical school that I won't name, but it's in Boston on Longwood Avenue. And they were so perplexed that somebody would want to combine medicine and engineering, they actually sent me to a psychiatrist for an interview. This is absolutely true story. In any event, biomedical engineering has come a long way, and I was privileged to serve on the board of the Whitaker Foundation, the scientific board, and the board of trustees, as the Whitaker Foundation did wonderful work, first supporting young investigators in biomedical engineering, and then eventually helping to fund and seed departments of biomedical engineering against many of the wishes of universities, I should say, but the result is, spectacular history. I also lobbied with several other people, the Congress and the National Institutes of Health, to get a position and ultimately an institute at the National Institutes of Health for Biomedical Engineering, which was also done against the objections of the NIH staff over many decades. So it's a wonderful tribute to see what's been accomplished. People that know me know that I'm very iconoclastic, so I'm going to talk about some crazy ideas, and one of which is ideas that will never work. In fact, I have a list of ideas that will never work, and unfortunately, many of the ideas that will never work on that list are things I said will never work, and ultimately they came to pass as extremely successful inventions or developments. And I want to talk a little bit about the process as we go through. Those of you who are over the age of 18, which is probably most of you, it's probably too late to change, but Albert Einstein, of course, said that common sense is nothing but a set of misconceptions acquired by age 18. I actually taught an undergraduate seminar at Johns Hopkins called Uncommon Sense for this reason, because I felt that many students at the university were really smart, but they lack the ability to engage their brain in different ways looking at practical problems in the world around them. So today I'll talk a little bit about the formula for success. One of the lessons is that history is always written by the victors, not the losers. And it's not what you know that will kill you, but it's what you don't know, what you think is true but isn't true. And finally, if you don't understand why something is the way it is, you need to figure it out, because it is that way for a reason. You just don't know that reason. So I invented a new mathematical language called the calculus of success. It's very simple. Success is a combination of preparation and opportunity. So preparation is both innate ability and hard work. I always wanted to be a center in the NBA. But I guess that was not going to happen because I lacked the innate ability. No matter how hard I worked at basketball, there was no way that I could do that. So you have to have some innate ability, but the combination of innate ability and hard work is what allows us in part to be successful. But the other important ingredient is opportunity, which some people call luck. In fact, if things don't go their way, they call it bad luck. If they go their way, they say it was because I was so good and prepared and so smart. That's the way it is, but it's important to recognize the role of opportunity in our success. So Louis Pasteur said chance favored the prepared mind. Somebody like Michael Bloomberg once said, the harder I work, the luckier I get. So you can't just be lucky, you have to have some understanding of the field or milieu in which you find yourself in order to recognize that luck. There are a number of books that I love to read, including Moneyball, which is one of my favorites, which is really about why experts in a field are almost always wrong, and how somebody can come into a field, in this case like the sport of baseball, and throw away all the advice of the experts and look at it more objectively and come up with a winning strategy. Recent bestseller book by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, points out how our mind works in ways that we never thought, why we're more biased than we think we are, and why we don't necessarily get the results that we think we should get. My favorite quote is this one by Albert Szent-Györgyi, a Nobel laureate, who said, "Discovery consists of seeing what everyone else has seen, but thinking what no one else has thought." And I'll give you a couple of examples of how that works. But if you look in retrospect at successful investments, in innovations and developments, you'll see why this plays out. And if you look at, for example, the discovery of X-rays by Röntgen, in 1895, he discovered a new kind of ray. But in fact, Röntgen was not the first person to generate X-rays. In fact, Hertz, who discovered radio waves, actually generated X-rays in his lab. He failed to recognize that he was dealing with a new phenomenon, and it's felt that there were probably 3 to 5 or more people who generated X-rays before Röntgen, but they failed to recognize that this was something new. So people who make major discoveries, in my observation, or major inventions are people that see things very differently. They see the same things that you and I see, but they think very differently about what the implication of those are. So one, obviously, is to recognize this is something new or different. Oftentimes, a young researcher will come and say, Dr. Brody, my experiment didn't work. Well, if you think about it, the experiment always works. It just doesn't necessarily produce the result you were expecting. And there are, again, a number of famous examples, like Alexander Fleming's discovery of penicillin, where the experiment didn't work, but they were about to throw away something that didn't work, and they left it around, and eventually he discovered penicillin mold growing in petri dishes for what was otherwise a failed experiment. But the other thing is, you can recognize something different, or you have a new idea, but do you have the courage to stand up to the herd? And there are famous psychological experiments where people come into a class and the instructor says, how many days are there in the year? And you say 365 or 365 and a quarter. And the rest of the class says, no, it's 363. And by the end of the class, the one person who said the right answer is convinced that it's 363. So peer pressure plays an enormous role. So let me give you an example of Dr. Barry Marshall. Dr. Barry Marshall was a physician in Australia. And in 1967, there was a publication in the Handbook of Physiology by a Japanese gastroenterologist named Dr. Ito. He had a stomach ulcer. And as I was taught in medical school, and as every fool plainly can see, or plainly knows, ulcers were discovered or caused by too much acid in the stomach. And in fact, there were ads for antacid on television, if you're old enough, where they would take a handkerchief and pour stomach acid and it would create a hole in it, and then they would pour Tums or one of these other antacids and milk of magnesia and it would neutralize it. And there were operations performed to cut the vagus nerve to the stomach so it wouldn't secrete so much acid. Not very successful, but performed widely. In 1967, Dr. Ito had himself endoscoped in his stomach, took a biopsy of his stomach, and published the biopsy, which is shown here, in his Handbook of Physiology. Now, probably tens of thousands of people read that chapter in the Handbook of Physiology, and the only person who seemed to notice that funny-looking structure in the center was Dr. Marshall, who said, gee, I wonder if that could be a bacterium. Well, as everybody knows, bacteria can't grow in high-acid environments, right? And so, despite that, Dr. Marshall began investigating. He had all of his colleagues against him. He had trouble growing the bacteria. Finally, he isolated what's called Helicobacterium pylori. And people said, well, it was a contaminant. So in order to fulfill Koch's postulates, he took a patient of his who had a gastric ulcer, put a tube down, took the stomach acid, and he drank it, and he became violently ill with gastritis to prove the fact that it was a transmissible disease. And today, the therapy for stomach ulcers, for benign stomach ulcers, not cancerous, is antibiotics, for which Dr. Marshall received the Nobel Prize in 2005, and his discovery completely changed the understanding of the etiology and the treatment of peptic ulcer disease. But for years, he was treated as a lunatic fringe, and there's a fine line, if you have a new idea, between perseveration and perseverance, okay? Perseverance is good old gumption. Now, hard work, don't give up. It's what Thomas Edison did to make the light bulb. Perseveration is what people with dementia, for example, people with Alzheimer's do. They try to open a door that's locked, and they keep trying to open the door without thinking of actually turning the key in the lock to unlock the door first. It's a very fine line between perseveration and perseverance. So I'm going to show you a video of something from the financial world of 2006 to demonstrate, even though you're right, it's very hard to stand up to the herd. And this is from one of these television financial stock programs, and I'll just play a short video. Peter Schiff was an investment manager. Uh-oh, didn't work. Let me see. We tried this out before and it worked. Is there any way we can play the video? We'll go back. Let me go back one. It won't go back. All right, I should click. There we go.
Recession or not, we're going to be joined by Art Laffer. He's Chief Investment Officer of Laffer Investments and former economic advisor to President Reagan. And Peter Schiff, he's president of Euro Pacific Capital. Gentlemen, thanks for being here. Peter, I want to start with you. Although there are more and more people saying that the U.S. economy will be in a recession next year, it is still a minority position. Why do you think that a recession is coming? Just how bad is it going to be?
I think it's going to be pretty bad, and whether it starts in 07 or 08, I think is immaterial, and I also think it's going to last not just for quarters, but for years. See, the basic problem with the U.S. economy is we have too much consumption and borrowing and not enough production and savings. And what's going to happen is the American consumer is basically going to stop consuming and start rebuilding his savings, especially when he sees his home equity evaporate. And when you have the economy 70% consumption, you can't address those imbalances without a recession. You know, rather than the recession being resisted, it should really be embraced, because the disease is all this debt-financed consumption. The cure is that we stop consuming and start saving and producing again, and that's a recession. And sometimes, you know, medicine tastes bad, but you got to swallow it.
Art Laffer, you hear him? He says the consumer is going to slow down in order to rebuild the savings.
Laffer's
and you know that
a very
two-thirds of the
famous
American
economist.
economy is driven by the consumer. Do you believe that?
No, I don't believe any of it whatsoever, Michelle. Excuse me, but you know what he's saying is that savings is way down in this country, but wealth has risen dramatically. The United States economy has never been in better shape. There is no tax increase coming in the next couple of years. Monetary policy is spectacular. We have freer trade than ever before. And not only that, but there are no incomes policies things here. I think Peter's just totally off base, and I don't think it's going to be, I mean, I just don't know where he's getting his stuff. The savings rate.
Okay. The rest, as they say, is history. Laffer goes on in that program to recommend some stocks. The one that I remember, he highly recommended Wachovia, which a year later, or a year and a half later, was bankrupt. Okay, so standing up to the herd is one thing. Now, there's another reason why we miss things, and so we're going to have a little quiz. So I want you to think about going to the newspaper and just select 100 numbers at random. And then take the highest order, the leftmost digit. So if it's 100, it's 1. If it's 2, it's 2. If it's 25, 64, it's still a 2, okay? So you count, so you'll have the leftmost digit will be a number from 1 to 9. And then I want you to count how many times in 100 numbers the number 1 appears as the highest order digit, how many times does the number 2 appear, and so on and so forth. You got it? Okay. Now, and then I want you to plot the percentage of time. How often does number 1 occur? How often does number 2 occur? How often does number 3 occur? And now here's the quiz, is to predict what will that plot look like. So I'm going to give you 3 choices. You have the black line, which says the number 1 occurs about almost twice as much as the number 2, and number 3 occurs less, and so forth. The white curve is just the opposite. It says the most common number would be 9 and much more common than 8 and so forth. Or many people would say maybe it's uniform. Every number occurs equally likely. So we're going to take a vote. How many people think it's the black plot with the number 1 more prevalent than 2? Okay. How many people think it's the white curve? And how many people think it's a uniform distribution? Okay, so the way this occurred is there was a man, actually this happened twice in history, about 100 years apart. But it's associated mostly with the man who was the second to discover it, not the first, which is not an unusual occurrence either. A man named Benford went to the library. Now, those of you that are old enough before computers and calculators, if you needed a logarithm, there was a book of logarithms. And you would go to the library and you would look up a number in the book of logarithms. And it was a big book. And in the front of the book were the numbers that started with 1, 2, 3. In the back of the book were numbers that started with 7, 8, 9. And Benford made the observation when he went to the library, he said, gee, the front pages of the book are worn and the back pages are hardly touched. Now, why is that? And he said, well, it must be that people are looking up the numbers that start with 1, 2, or 3 more often than they look up numbers that start with 7, 8, or 9. And so then he went to the newspaper and he went to a variety of sources and picked numbers at random and began to plot it. And he found, in fact, that it had the black curve where it was where the number 1 was far more common than the number 2, and the number 8, 7, 8, 9 were very, very less common. And it seemed to work for a variety of things. So here he has. And he came up with a law, which you see, it's a logarithmic characteristic, and it fits very well. He looked at newspaper numbers, he looked at census data, he looked at Dow Jones, he even looked at baseball statistics, which I'm surprised that seemed to work as well. So Benford's law follows this rule, which is an interesting phenomenon. Now, this is where it makes it more interesting. If you cheat on your income tax, or you cheat on your expense report, many people who cheat believe that any number is equally likely as any other number. So if they spread numbers around, they'll tend to spread even numbers around, even distributions of numbers. The Internal Revenue Service, unbeknownst to you, but known to me because of this article, audits your income tax and they test the frequency of numbers to see if it follows Benford's law or not. So the point about this is the greatest obstacle to knowledge is not ignorance, because if you know you don't know something, you know it and you compensate for it. But the real obstacle is when you think you know something is true, in fact it isn't true. Or what I said, it's not what you don't know that'll kill you, it's what you don't know that you don't know. Whatever, okay? So here's an example of a fraudulent tax return. You can see true tax data in the very light color. I can't tell what color it is. Looks like maybe orange. And you can see Benford's law, but the fraudulent curve sticks out like a sore thumb. So, and I talked to somebody who was a CEO of a Fortune 100 company, Norm Augustine. Some of you know Norm, very smart guy. I said, do you know about Benford's law? He said, yeah. He said, I used it to audit employees' expense reports at Lockheed Martin. Okay. Now, what is this? This is a turtle, right? What's the turtle doing on the fence post? How did the turtle get on the fence post? Did it get there on its own? No, all right? So the moral to this is that if you see a turtle on a fence post, if you see something that doesn't seem to belong or be right, you should try to figure it out, because there's got to be a reason. The turtle got on the fence post for a reason. Most likely, in this case, somebody put it on the fence post. And if you don't figure it out, it can be very costly. So I'll give you an example of a turtle on the fence post for me. This is a picture of the Johns Hopkins campus, the Homewood campus. There's a lower quad and an upper quad, and a beautiful marble staircase, highly symmetrical. And if you look at the right staircase, we're just going to go up there, you'll see this is what it looks like. There's a building, and behind the building there are a variety of faculty offices and labs. And this shows how beautiful it is. But in fact, when I arrived as president, in front of that, I don't have a pointer, but in front of those windows was a plywood shed. And the plywood shed was about 6 to 8 feet high and was probably 20 feet deep and 10 feet wide. And it was plastered with graffiti. and it looked like, somebody had gone to Home Depot, bought some plywood, and nailed the thing up. I mean, it looked terrible. So I was walking with the Board of Trustees, who at the time happened to be Michael Bloomberg before he ran for mayor. He's a Johns Hopkins graduate. And Michael says, "Brody, what's that shed doing there? It looks like heck, I said, "Beats me." He said, "Well, why don't you get rid of it?" I said, "Good idea." So without asking why the shed was there, I picked up the phone. I called the maintenance people. I said, "Get rid of that shack." The next morning, the shed came down. Guess what? There was nothing inside the shed. Now, there was probably somebody who knew why the shed was there, but that person was long since gone. So we got rid of the shed. I'm feeling great. By the way, that decision cost the president's office $75,000. Why? Because in those two windows, the lower windows, inside was a physiology laboratory, and they were studying the chemicals that insects use to signal one another. All right, very dilute substances. And what was happening is dogs from the neighborhood were coming and urinating on the brick wall outside the laboratory, and the odor of the urine was overpowering the physiology experiments. So they had constructed that shed probably 20 years before to keep the dogs from peeing right next to where they were doing the experiments. So we had to move the entire laboratory. So my point is that the same kind of observations can help you in life. If you see something in your data, you see something in a clinical study that doesn't seem to fit with what you expect, you should try to figure it out, because it probably is there for a reason. Now, the history of science is like the history of geopolitical events. The victors write the history books. And so we always look back. We look at the iPhone. We look at these wonderful inventions, and the story fits together in such a logical, cohesive, coherent fashion, right? So the 5 discoveries that changed the digital world: the iPod, the iPad, the iPhone. I'm sorry about Android, but Android's probably in there, with apologies to Samsung. The VHS videotape, the Intel microprocessor. I mean, everybody's got their list. And you read the history of Intel and the microprocessor, it reads like a wonderful detective story, as though they knew exactly how it was going to work out. Okay, here were 5 discoveries that were predicted. These were sure bets. The Osborne portable computer, looked like a carry-on suitcase. The Apple Newton, remember the Sony Betamax videotape? Or the next computer that Steve Jobs developed, or the Z80 microprocessor. It's not that these were not good things, but for whatever reason, they didn't make it, and they're gone, and unless you read a very specialized book in the library, you're unlikely to know anything about them unless you live through the computer era at the time that this happens. So the fact is that the world prospectively looks very different than it does retrospectively, and our ability to predict winners and losers is very limited. So now I'm going to give you the 5 stages of clinical innovation. Here we go. Somebody comes up with an idea and everybody says, that'll never work. Well, then they publish some data with some animals. Well, it worked in animals, but I'll be damned, that's never going to work in people. Well, then they do an initial study with a few people. Yes, it worked in a small group of patients, but they were highly selective. Well, it worked in a large group of patients, this is the next study, but it requires specialized expertise that's not generally available. And then ultimately, this thing is a resounding success, and the person says, yeah, of course it works. Actually, I came up with the same idea, but I never bothered to publish it. Okay. So everything looks obvious in retrospect. So here's some examples that would never work. I was involved, I was a resident in cardiac surgery with Dr. Norman Shumway in late 1960s, early 70s. He developed the heart transplant operation, and we were slaving over these operations, and every time I would come home and I would say to my wife, transplanting an unpaired organ like the heart is absolute folly, right? Today, heart transplant operations are done by community hospitals. So my assumptions at the time were sort of right, but a couple things happened. One I actually had a little bit to do with. When I was at the NIH, Dr. Bruce Reitz and I developed a technique of storing and preserving the heart in a bucket of specialized saline so that you could actually then transport a heart from the donor, wherever the donor was in a hospital, to where the recipient was at a different hospital. But the real key was the development of cyclosporin, which made rejection a much less of an issue, a rejection and infection, and so management of the patients became something that didn't require highly specialized expertise only available in an academic center, but could be done in a routine clinical practice. So X-ray computed tomography, Godfrey Hounsfeld came up with a prototype from EMI. EMI made the Beatles records, among other things. And EMI said, well, we can't market this thing, so we'll go to the X-ray companies. They went to GE and Siemens and Philips and showed them the X-ray computed tomography, and they all said, nah, that'll never work. The rest, of course, is history. Positron emission tomography, another idea that wouldn't work until people figured out that, well, you could compensate for the spatial resolution by combining PET with computed tomography, and eventually people figured out how to make positron emitting isotopic compounds freely available even to community hospitals. Magnetic resonance imaging, I was sure MRI said MRI will never work, and my assumptions were absolutely flawless. I said the resolution of an image depends on the wavelength. It's the Bragg diffraction limit. And the wavelength of energy used for MRI is meters. So I said, with meters of wavelength, how can you get millimeter resolution? And I was right until a couple of people who won the Nobel Prize eventually, Lauterbur and Ernst, came up with an idea of encoding position with frequency and got around the Bragg diffraction limit, and the rest is history. Angioplasty, another idea that I didn't say this wouldn't work, but a lot of people did. And finally, when stents came along, I was a faculty member at Stanford. We were doing interventional radiology. We needed to hire a new radiologist, and we had two finalists. One was for this position, a faculty position. One was an experienced clinician from the Cleveland Clinic, and the other was a young investigator radiologist who was at the VA hospital associated with the University of California, Davis, and he was working around with some interesting devices. I claim that I voted for him to be hired. Unfortunately, there's no written record to back my story. Whatever the reason, we hired the other person from the Cleveland Clinic. The person we didn't hire is Julio Palmez, who is the co-inventor of the coronary stent. And Julio could probably buy Stanford Hospital today. So anyway, there are many more. Cyberonics, we saw the award for Rhys Terry, and cyberonics was an idea that everybody said would never work, but fortunately he persisted. So the experts are always wrong. So I'm going to give you a recipe for smart choices. This is for young people who are going to conferences like this one, but I'll give you an example because I was involved directly. So in 1979, I went to an international meeting. This was the Radiology Society of North America, 35,000 people, hundreds of papers being given, thousands of papers probably. And I was selected to give a paper. And so you had identical rooms side by side at 2 o'clock to give a paper, and then another group at 2:30. So in my room, there were 100 seats. It was an overflowing crowd, and people were angry in the back because they couldn't get into my talk. The room next door had about 10 to 15 attendees, and I think probably half of them were from the presenter's department or co-authors on the paper. So now the question is to the young people in the audience, you're going to this conference and you have an opportunity to go to my talk and fight your way in the room, or you have the opportunity to go into room B. Which room will you go into? How many people will go in room A? How many people will go in room B? All right. Well, not too many people vote. Maybe we don't have that many young people. So here's the answer. Here's the answer. Room A, when I was at Stanford with Al Makovsky and Norbert Pelk and others, we developed a technique called dual energy imaging. It's a way of taking two X-ray images very quickly at different wavelengths and use that to selectively image material. So this is a digital radiograph of one of the two that's produced. And we could take that and we could subtract out on the left, we could subtract out the bones, or we could subtract out the soft tissues on the right. And in fact, that happens to be my chest image. And so a friend of mine, Chuck Mastretta, looked at this and said, yes, on the left, that's a spineless Bill Brody, and on the right is a heartless Bill Brody. Anyway, this created quite a buzz, as you can imagine, because of its graphical presentation. But in fact, people are still giving papers on dual energy. Anybody here giving a paper on dual energy subtraction? Probably is. It's an interesting area, but it never really made Broadway hit for clinical application. So what was in the room next door? It was a paper on magnetic resonance imaging. Now today, if you go to the meeting, the MRI meetings have 2,000 of the brightest people in the world in them, and I would argue if you're a young person looking for an area, go somewhere where all those people aren't, because it's a lot easier to make your mark. So if you want to be successful, you have to be a contrarian, you have to be able to stand up to the herd, and you can't trust the experts. As Robert Foss said, I came to a fork in the road, I took the road less traveled. So the herd is always wrong, and if you think about it, it's why when the star in Sports Illustrated and the star quarterback is on the cover of Sports Illustrated, all of a sudden their career, goes to hell after that, because everybody's gunning for them. And if you're in an area that's hotly contested, it gets very hard to make your mark. So music to my ears when somebody says everybody knows that, or somebody says, well, it's not possible, or the experiment didn't work. When I went to the National Heart Institute, NIH, in 1973, I worked for a man, Glenn Morrow, who was one of the pioneers in cardiovascular surgery and research, and he had published hundreds of papers, and he announced to the clinical associates, myself included, that all the interesting work in cardiovascular disease had been done and there was nothing left to be done. This, of course, was before angioplasty and understanding the role of lipids in heart disease and all the things that have happened. So again, the experts have a view which oftentimes is really misguided. So my three caveats in summary are, we're terrible at predicting future outcomes. Secondly, what you think you know to be true can oftentimes not be true, particularly if it's what the experts tell you. And things are the way they are for a reason, you just may not know why. So finally, I just close with this quote by Albert Einstein: to punish me for my contempt for authority, fate made me an authority myself. And finally, closing, the Salk Institute is one of the three historic landmarks of California. It's located about 25 minutes from here, just north in La Jolla. We have architectural tours every day. If you're staying around and have time, you're welcome to come for a visit. Thank you very much.
We have time to take some questions for Dr. Brody. Does anyone have any questions about things you don't know, or things you know you should know?
What you don't know.
Right. Anybody? Yes. Can you go to the microphone up there? Yes.
My name is Misha Pavel. I'm at the National Science Foundation. And one of my jobs is to run panels. And no matter how much I push my panelists to go for the innovative and high-risk applications, it's always difficult. We manage, but it's hard. I was wondering if you have a thought about ideas that we could implement to make it more rewarding for innovative approaches or innovative proposals.
I wish I had the solution for that. The National Institutes of Health, of course, has a peer review process which really accentuates not taking risk. It becomes extraordinarily risk averse. Part of it is how many grants you're funding. If you're funding 20% of applications, there will be de facto risky applications that get funded. If you're funding at the 10 percentile or below, there's no room. You put an application in and you happen to misspell a name on an author of a paper and that person is reviewing your grant, you're toast. So I'm not sure what the result is. DARPA, of course, has a wonderfully interesting mechanism that the NIH is trying to do in their Pioneer and Innovator, their discovery grants, where they don't have a team of people evaluating, they have one. I know NSF has a more similar approach. But we are generally, particularly as we get over the age of 15 or 20, we become very risk averse. And I once went to a talk to a group of CEOs, and there was a kid who had dropped out of Stanford at age 19 to start a company. He was very successful. And the first slide he put up was 80% of Nobel laureates made their discovery within 5 years of getting their PhD. I mean, we just become very, very conservative. There are other ways to do it, but it's difficult when all of us are clamoring, for a fair, transparent process, and those things get out of whack. It's the nature of the beast. And I wish I had a better answer for you. It's a great question.
Any other questions for Dr. Brody? Well, actually, I would like to invite Dr. Pettigrew maybe to come up. Dr. Pettigrew is the program director for NIBIB. Perhaps you can say a few words. He's also a radiologist and engineer. So.
Director, I'm sorry. Thank you. Good morning. I appreciate the opportunity to make some impromptu remarks. And they're so impromptu that you don't have to worry about them being long. I appreciate Dr. Leong, who just came over to me a few minutes ago and asked me if I would like to take this opportunity to greet the audience. Let me first correct, I'm not a program director. I'm actually the director of the National Institute of Biomedical Imaging and Bioengineering. I want to congratulate the organizers of this conference. I was particularly struck by the theme, Engineering Innovations for Global Health. So timely it is, this theme. When we consider where we are today in healthcare and where we need to be, it becomes quite clear that the only practical way to get there is through technological innovation. It is the only means by which we have a reasonable opportunity to improve our ability to detect disease at an earlier stage, to fashion therapies that are more precisely tailored to these diseases, and to make this accessible to everyone. There's simply no other way to do all of that simultaneously than through technological and engineering innovation. So again, I congratulate you on the theme and the approach for this conference. There's one other thing I'd like to say specifically to the young people. Hopefully, Bill, there are more people in the audience that are young than raise their hands. And that is that our institute has developed a competition, a prize for undergraduate engineering students. It is called the Debut Prize, and Debut is an acronym which stands for Design by Undergraduate Teams. This prize is $10,000 given to each of 3 teams that compete for prizes in 3 categories. And these are new designs for diagnostics, therapeutics is the second category, and new technologies that are designed to serve the underserved populations is a third category. So I want to encourage you to go to our website, find out about this, apply for it. This has been in existence for 1 year. We'll make the first prizes. The awards will be given later this fall, and you can read about that as well. I'd also then like to close with one of my favorite quotes, Bill, as you have set the stage with your rather interesting array of quotes. This is for the young people in the audience, and it comes from the storied president of Morehouse College, which many of you probably never heard of, but this was a school that I attended and Martin Luther King attended. And the president, who is an icon in the annals of education and inspiring young people, made the observation or the statement to the youth that whatever you do, strive to do it so well that no man living or dead or yet to be born can do it better. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you. So I would like to thank our speaker, Dr. Brody. Can you just wait 1 minute? We something for you here. So as you give this whole pile of stuff. So thank you very much for giving this talk and coming to here.
Thank you.
Okay. So that concludes the plenary keynote lecture for this morning. So enjoy yourselves. There'll be more lectures later on, and the oral sessions and poster sessions. So have a good conference. Thank you.